Great. I think it's working. Hey, everybody. Let's see here on Twitter. Great. All right. I am Brantley Milligan, Director of Operations at ENS, and I'm here with creator, father, lead developer, Nick Johnson.
Hello.
And we are going to be talking about ENS and just kind of like its current state, where we've been, where we're going. We're going to answer questions. I'm going to see if I can be able to like watch for questions here. You know, feel free to just like ask a question. All right, this guy Block Bake says it's working. Great. Nick, feel free to retweet it as well if you want to help get this around.
Yep.
Looks like we've got 12 people watching right now. This is getting kind of serious, you know?
Yeah, hello all 12 of you.
Okay, yeah, feel free to ask a question like in the replies, I guess. Or on the live comments on Twitter. Now it says 30 people. Okay, this is great. Okay, so Nick, how are you doing today?
Pretty good, yeah.
Great, so do you want to talk, just tell people what is ENS? Let's just give people a basic overview.
All right, probably not news to most of you, but let's go for it. ENS is the Ethereum name service, which is a distributed naming system designed to be censorship resistant and sort of independent and basically an improvement all around on internet naming, particularly when it comes to crypto resources such as cryptocurrency accounts and so forth, as well as things like IPFS content. So we're building ENS on top of the Ethereum blockchain and using it to name pretty much everything.
Yes. Now, ENS launched back in May of 2017 on a very special day. You want to share that story at all?
Well, so originally it was going to be, you're putting me on the spot here, because originally it was going to be Pi Day, March the 14th. And at the time, like shortly before that, somebody identified a significant issue with with one of our contracts that we had to remedy. So we had to push the date back. And I'm momentarily blanking on what the significance of our actual launch date is.
Oh, May the 4th.
That's, of course, Star Wars.
May the 4th be with you, yeah.
May the 4th be with you. So we launched then with the initial registrar, which was an interim solution, basically, while we sort of tested the system out, sort of a beta launch that used an auction system to allocate names. And then after 2 years, which was the plan, we migrated to the new permanent registrar, which is what we have today and is much simpler to interact with.
Mm-hmm. You like instant registrations. There's an annual fee system, which is vastly superior, I think. Yeah, thanks to all the people who are coming. We're having a bigger group here. Feel free to ask questions, in the comments there on Twitter. If you're watching this on YouTube, I'm not really watching YouTube right now. So if you want to ask, if you put a question there, I'm not going to see it. Okay. Yeah, so the way I think about ENS is that it is, it in some ways is accomplishing the same basic task of DNS in that you have names and you have resources, right? So it's trying to bridge this gap between computer identifiers and human readable names, right? So because what's easy for software to read, let's say a long string of numbers, letters, you can have 30 characters of something, one character is different. Software can instantly recognize that, no problem. Humans obviously can't. Humans, though, we interact with language that has context and shifting meanings and things like this. And that's more difficult for computers to really deal with or to appropriately designate things. So a naming service bridges the gap between these two worlds, the human and the computer. And that's why we have it. The existing domain name system of the internet is great. It works extremely well. I mean, it works so well that most people don't even think about it. Like they forget that DNS exists because they so it's so rare for them to have a problem with it, and it just works. And it's something that, just a bunch of, computer geeks created in the 1980s, and that they've been able to scale it up to billions of users using it all the time. It really is a spectacular achievement. I will say, working with ENS, it's made me learn more about DNS, and it's made me really appreciate that spectacular achievement. However, DNS was built with the best, it was designed with the best of 1980s computer technology. And there's some things that it does really, really well, but there's some things that it doesn't do very well. And there are things that ENS does not do very well, at least right now. And there's some things that ENS does very well. And there's things that ENS can do that DNS is not even capable of doing. So for example, self-custody, you mentioned censorship resistance. So ENS, because it's blockchain based, it has a completely different paradigm where a user can own and control domain directly without necessarily a trusted third party. That does not even make sense in the DNS architecture. There's always somebody who's running the system for you.
And to sort of expand on that, there's a moderately famous trilemma called Zuko's triangle, which is named after the Zuko of Zcash fame, because he worked on distributed content systems before he ever launched Zcash. And his trilemma is that you can't have a naming system that is human meaningful, secure, and censorship resistant. And it's easy to come up with examples that satisfy any two of those three. But prior to consensus systems like the Ethereum blockchain, there wasn't really a way to build one that satisfied all three. You had to give up on one of those. And I think Zuko's acknowledged himself that blockchain and distributed consensus systems are able to sort of solve Zuko's triangle.
Yes, this was a problem in particular in the Tor community, right? So they're all about censorship resistance, and they have computer generated hashes that point towards Tor hidden services, but they can't use DNS. It's not secure enough.
And so they've chosen the two, censorship resistance and security, and given up on human meaningfulness.
Correct.
For Daniel identifiers.
Great. Something else I wanted to talk about on this were like common misconceptions about ENS. So the first one is, and Nick, I'd like you to talk about these. Is ENS only .eth names? Like, is ENS .eth names?
So no, definitely not. The ENS is a complete namespace, just like DNS is. And in that namespace, initially we only had .eth, but there's a couple of things there. One is that because it is a namespace, we can in principle add to it. We can have any TLD, but we want to behave and interact well with the legacy naming system, DNS, and with what we call the global namespace, basically all the names in DNS and everything compatible with it. And so we've committed to not adding our own TLDs beyond .eth, but we've also committed to interoperating with that. So we have DNS integration with DNSSEC, which allows users to, with DNS names like Brantley.com, for instance, to claim the corresponding name in ENS. It doesn't mean they get Brantley.eth, it means they get Brantley.com inside ENS, and they can do all the things they would do with a .eth name with their standard DNS names. And we've been working on that for a while. It's enabled for .xyz on mainnet, and we've just rolled out on the Ropsten testnet support for this with every TLD that has sufficient DNSSEC support. And DNSSEC here is the DNS security extensions, which basically means that we have a way to cryptographically prove who owns a name on the Ethereum blockchain, which is not something you had with traditional DNS. And about sort of 95 to 98% of top level domains have it enabled and set up. So it basically means that when we roll this out to all top level domains, just about any domain you own, you'll be able to claim on ENS.
Yes, and all the ones you've heard of. I mean, like the ones that don't are smaller ones that you probably haven't heard of.
Mostly they're country codes, country code domains that their countries haven't rolled out DNSSEC yet.
Correct. Yeah, so to me, the key concept here is that ENS is like naming infrastructure that can run any names, like any arbitrary names we could technically, put onto ENS. And that just .eth was kind of the founding one, but we're now putting the DNS namespace on there. That I think is critical for a lot of people to understand. A lot of people equate ENS with .eth names. Yes, so another key big misconception is that ENS names are only for naming your Ethereum address. Nick, is that true?
No, and so you can, initially when we first rolled out, the first thing we supported was using .eth names to name Ethereum addresses, but it was always our ambition to support more than that. And today we not only support naming other cryptocurrencies, like Bitcoin or any other cryptocurrency that you could care to think of, we also support naming other resources such as websites. So for instance, if you host your content on IPFS, you can point to that from your ENS name. If you are using MetaMask on Chrome, you can type in, for instance, lmonet.eth with a slash at the end, and it will take you to that decentralized website on IPFS. If you are using, if you're not using MetaMask on Chrome or one of several other browser integrations that are supported, you can add .link to the end of any .eth name, and it will resolve for you in just a standard browser. So lmonet.eth.link, which resolves using a gateway service, which we recently partnered with Cloudflare to take over, and it will resolve that distributed web content for you.
Yes. So when I tell people that ENS can support, let's say like Bitcoin addresses, like you can send Bitcoin to Brantley.xyz, and that's ENS making that happen. People are often confused. One, just they have some misconceptions in their minds, but also they don't know how could you send Bitcoin to a name that lives on Ethereum? Like that doesn't make sense. I think what it is that most people, they overcomplicate what naming services are doing. So they think that if I send, let's say, Ether or an ERC20 token, okay, to Brantley.eth, it's the standard case. They think that somehow like the payment is actually going to like Brantley.eth and that ENS is like somehow forwarding the payment along or something like this. It's not that complicated. Really what's happening is that the wallet, you just type in Brantley.eth, the wallet goes and grabs the Ethereum address, and then it just sends it on the Ethereum blockchain to that address. Now it maybe hides that in the background, but that's what's really going on. This is why you can also send Bitcoin to Brantley.eth or Dogecoin to Brantley.eth. The wallet is just grabbing the Dogecoin address and then sending it on the Dogecoin network. ENS is just simply providing the information.
Yeah, and that's ultimately under the hood. That's what systems like DNS do as well. When you go to google.com, your computer is contacting a particular IP address, but it's all handled transparently for you.
Yes. So ENS sort of has like two primary use cases. It's for naming cryptocurrency wallets. So you have one name for like 100 different, cryptocurrencies, and that's really different blockchains. So if you're dealing with, let's say, an Ethereum-based token or assets, like an NFT or an ERC20 token, the fact that you have an Ethereum address in your ENS records means that you can send those things to an ENS name. And then we also support like the top 100 blockchains. So practically everything you're going to want us to do, we support. So that's like our kind of bread and butter use case. Another primary use case that we have is the decentralized web. So like IPFS hashes. So I'd say it's like crypto wallets, decentralized web. But a cool thing about ENS is that just because it's a naming service, it can store any information. So conceivably, you could use it for any use case, even ones we haven't thought of. And we can accomplish this in two ways. One way is that if somebody had some new use case that was like really important or was really widely used, we could actually create a dedicated record type for it. But in the meantime, we have text records, and text records allow people just to store any arbitrary information. So like if you have a cryptocurrency project or a blockchain project, and you have some identifier that it would be really useful to store in an ENS record, then you don't have to ask our permission. You don't have to like get us to add it to our system or anything like that. You can just use text records to do it right away, which is really powerful.
And on the first case, we're talking about, we can do this and we can do that, but really ENS is ultimately a permissionless system. And we're based on internet standards. We use EIPs to standardize our content. Anyone can write their own resolver that defines a new record type. And if they want it to be widely accepted, they can write up an EIP describing that record type and so forth. And you can deploy that resolver to your name and use it immediately without needing to wait for us to approve it or give permission or anything like that. We try and help coordinate things, and we maintain a particular resolver called the public resolver that has sort of useful near universal functionality that lots of people want. But ultimately, we're not gatekeepers here. We don't control what kind of record types there are on ENS. We don't control, what your resolver can do. That's entirely up to you.
Yes, that is a very important point. Maybe this would also be a useful time to kind of explain our structure. So ENS, so sometimes, we'll say like, oh, we work for ENS or something. That's not really accurate. Okay, so the Ethereum name service is an open source project, and nobody can work for an open source project, right? We may work on it or might be contributors to it or something like this, but the Ethereum name service is an open source project that nobody owns. Okay, so we then have a nonprofit organization called True Names Limited. It's incorporated in Singapore. It's publicly known, and we work for that. So there's me, Nick. We have some other people on our team, and I would say we are the de facto maintainer. We're the de facto like developers and managers and contributors to it. So anybody can contribute to the project. People can fork ENS. People can do with it anything they want. But we're just sort of the de facto people managing the project.
And it's probably a good time too to talk about the structure of ENS as a whole. And there's been some discussion of this in the Discord recently. And it's we try and be as open as possible. So it's probably good to to expand on it for anyone interested at home. ENS itself, the core component of it is the ENS registry. And the way it works is it's hierarchical. So if you own nick.eth, then you can create subdomains, wallet.nick.eth and so forth. And you can hand those subdomains out to other people if you want and do anything you want with them. But as the owner of nick.eth, you ultimately have the power to reassign those subdomains, delete them, recreate them, what have you. There are ways to sort of give away that power, but by default, if you control a name, then you control all the names underneath it indirectly by having the power to reassign them. And so .eth itself, the sort of the parent of all .eth names, is owned by a contract called the .eth registrar that hands out names and sets their rules for issuance and renewal and so forth. But there's another level above that, which is the root node, which is sort of the empty name. And that controls all of the top level domains. It controls .eth, it controls all of the DNS integrations and so forth. And that name is held indirectly by a multisig. And the reason for this is that ENS is still a system under development, and it's a system that requires maintenance from time to time. For instance, we're rolling out this new DNS integration support. And in order to do that, we have to have some way to enable it on the root. And so at the moment, our interim solution is that we have this multi-sig. It is controlled by 7 key holders from throughout the Ethereum community. So unlike many projects, this isn't a multi-sig of several people who work directly on ENS, and it isn't a multi-sig purely for security purposes against compromise of a computer, it's 7 independent people. I'm one of them, but the other 6 are not associated with ENS, and we explicitly ask them to exercise their judgment on what things are good for the development of ENS and good for ENS's users and so forth. So on the occasions where we've asked them to take action, we expect them to look carefully at what we're asking and whether it's good for ENS and good for the ecosystem, whether it preserves users' interests. So we believe that as an interim solution, that's a pretty good protection against hostile takeover, against malicious behavior, against compromise of any one person's computer and so forth. And it still preserves our ability to make sure that if something went horribly wrong, if it was an awful bug, we could go to the key holders and say, hey, we need to do this in order to protect the system. If there's an upgrade, such as the new DNSSEC support, then we can go to them and say, hey, will you support this upgrade, while minimizing the risks. In the longer term, we want to devolve and decentralize the key holders' powers. And the thing we're working on in the short term for that is the way the root is owned, there is a sort of an interim contract which makes it possible for the key holders to revoke their own powers over a top-level domain. Once they revoke it, even the key holders have no power to affect it. And so our interim, first sort of step towards further decentralization of the root will be to, once we're confident and we've got an additional audit on the .eth registrar, that contract that governs issuance of subdomains, will be to ask them to revoke their own power over that top-level domain. And once they've done that, they won't be able to upgrade it. They won't be able to replace the registrar with a new one. But there also won't be any route by which they could even theoretically reassign ownership of a .eth name or have any control over it. To be clear, that power would be difficult for them to exercise today, and I think it's extremely unlikely that any of them would see that as being even close to an acceptable behavior. But we can remove that human component entirely, and that's the sort of the process we want to follow. I think there's a real spectrum in the Ethereum community over how decentralization of power works. Some systems have simply said, hey, we've got a multi-sig and that's it, that's good enough for us forever, which I think is short-sighted. And others have simply locked everything in stone on launch, which I think is dangerous. I mean, it depends on the project, but certainly in the case of ENS, where we need a single sort of coherent system, I think that would be dangerous. So we're trying to pursue a middle approach here, where we decentralize as quickly as we safely can, because our number one priority is to avoid doing anything that could put users at risk.
Yes. I mean, of course, this, I don't know how philosophical we want to get. There's locking in stone certain smart contracts, right? But then, of course, no one is required to use those smart contracts. I mean, there's the ultimate backstop for anything is people can just say, hey, everybody, let's have a social consensus to stop using that contract because there's a bug, and let's just redeploy now without a bug, and everybody uses that, and that thing we just like pretend like it doesn't exist anymore. That is so, because all these things are ultimately just like socially created. I mean, there is no
That's more or less how, for instance, Uniswap works, or at least did initially. They deploy the contracts, they're immutable. If they deploy a new version, then everyone has to migrate over to that voluntarily. There's no admin keys that allow a migration, which I think is an excellent approach. But it's significantly more difficult for ENS because it's really important in a naming system that there is a single source of truth. And if you potentially have two naming systems and my wallet is updated to the new naming system and your wallet is still on the old naming system, you could end up with a situation where you say, oh yeah, just send it to bob.eth. But you've got one version of bob.eth and I've got another, and I end up sending it to a different Bob or to an attacker or whatnot.
Yes.
So it's really crucial in a naming system that there is one naming system that people mean when they talk about ENS, not 2 or 3, not the latest one in the previous version, because the risks from that can be far higher than the risks from from bugs in some ways.
Yes, we've got a question here. It's a 2-part question from the same person. It says, can we get refunds on .eth names since they are nothing special now? And does the .eth name, does the .eth TLD have any unique functionality that other TLDs don't have?
Yeah, so I think the second is the answer to the first in a way. The key way in which .eth differs from DNS TLDs is that ownership of .eth can be enforced entirely inside the system. So right now, the only potential risk to your ownership of your name is the key holders, and soon even that won't be the case. Although even as it stands, the key holders have a commitment to neutrality and to non-interference when it comes to own name ownership. But all of those things can be enforced by the smart contract. You can look at the code and you can say, oh, I can see here that there is no way for anyone else to gain ownership of my .eth name. That's not a promise that it's possible to make on DNS, because DNS has the standard systems around seizure of names, around expiries and reclaims and all that sort of stuff. If you register a DNS name and it gets seized, or it gets deissued, or simply you let it expire and then somebody else registers it, then that name ownership will have to be reflected in the Ens registry at some point. And so there's no way to conclusively sort of enforce ownership of a DNS name. So if, for instance, you want to issue subdomains to somebody, then I would say the only secure way to do that is on a .eth name, because if you do it on a DNS name, you're always ultimately relying on the owner of that name to behave honestly. And so no refunds, unfortunately.
Yes, so there's no refunds, but yeah, everything, I agree with everything you said. The way I would put it is that .eth names are blockchain native and all the benefits that come from that. So even DNS names on ENS, they can do a lot of the same things. They actually can't do everything. Like they can't be ultimately owned. And, it's not self-custody. They can't be ultimately owned by a smart contract, things like this. They could be controlled by a smart contract, but the control of that could always be revoked by the DNS owner. So there are benefits to using a DNS name on ENS, but there's pros and cons, just like there's pros and cons about .eth names. So .eth names do have some unique functionality. Also, just simply say that even if they didn't, it's just simply a different namespace. So it's not like, oh, because .org exists, therefore .com is like useless or something like this. There's just more namespace. So the premise of the question, I would disagree with, but in fact, there is unique functionality for .eth names.
Yeah, definitely.
Good.
So people on the original Twitter thread had a few questions as well. One thing that came up was questions about progress on layer 2 and our plans for layer 2. So that seems like a good thing to discuss. It's something I've been actively working on so far this year. In short, we had two, perhaps it's three, open community calls where we discussed and hashed out potential strategies for supporting layer 2 on ENS. And the sort of genesis of this was a post by Vitalik where he proposed a potential system for doing ENS resolution via layer 2s. And through our talks and so forth, we further refined that and improved it to the point where what we have now is what we believe will be a really useful general purpose system, not just for ENS, but in general for reading data from a layer 2 in a way that the person, the client, the whatever doing the reading doesn't have to be aware of the details of the layer 2. They don't even have to know which layer 2 they're interacting with. So this means you can take all manner of systems that have data you want to be able to read off a blockchain, and you can push that data into a layer 2 in such a way that your clients can read that data out transparently to which layer 2 it is. And this works really well for ENS. So the idea is that this will make it possible to, for the owner of a name, to push resolution of their name onto a layer 2, but also for them to push all of the subdomains onto a layer 2. So you could buy my.eth or something.eth and say all the subdomains of this will be hosted on Optimism. And then that makes it very easy for you to create and issue subdomains to users quickly and cheaply. and then have them resolve in supported wallets the same way that a regular ENS name would. So step one for that was developing a basic demo of the underlying technology, which we've already done and demonstrated. Step two is refining that demo with an actual layer 2 implementation and an actual ENS resolution. So basically going from, is the general basic technology viable for reading data from a layer 2 to, can you implement something, a non-toy problem like ENS on top of this? And that's what I'm working on at the moment. I'm about halfway through a viable, sort of minimum viable implementation of it. And then step 3 after that is once we've proven the viability of all of this, to start building up standards and writing it down and getting community approval for what we think will be a very useful system beyond just even ENS itself. And then from there, we can go on to implementing it in a production setting and making it a real thing and rolling it out to everyone. One of the novel things about this is none of this requires keyholder approval. This is not in the realm of the keyholders. This is again, because ENS is designed as an extensible system. It's possible to make all of these changes and make ENS more useful with nobody's permission. We wouldn't have to be the people developing this. Anybody could build stuff like this on top of ENS. But that's the short version, and that's what we're working on right now. And I'm optimistic we'll be able to show off some really cool stuff really soon.
Yes, this is critical for the people watching. I'm sure you've noticed that gas prices are out of control. We've said on our website for years that we would eventually like to decentralize that further. But we're not a DAO project. Like, we're not experts in DAOs or something like this. And we're sort of just waiting for that sector to mature more. And we just want to be very careful because we really view ENS as basic infrastructure, not only for the blockchain community, but possibly for the whole internet. So we're not thinking in terms of like months or even years. We're thinking like decades. We don't want to, mess this up. So we do want to do that, but we want to be just careful with doing that.
Just to be clear, when you talk about decades, you're talking about ENS's impact and evolution, not necessarily about how long it will take us to work on decentralization.
Correct. Thank you. If that wasn't clear.
I think it's worth expanding on that sort of aspect of governance, which is, I guess there's a couple of factors. One is any replacement governance mechanism for ENS components needs to be capture resistant. And so that means that it shouldn't be possible for an interested party to acquire enough shares or votes or whatever the system uses in order to take over a key component of the system and basically cause chaos. If you imagine a naive system where we launched and we gave over ownership of the ENS root to a DAO where the shares were handed out according to registration figures, you can very easily imagine a situation where someone buys up a quorum of shares, reassigns the root to themselves, and then either registers themselves thousands of names for free, or much worse, reassigns existing users' names to point to them. And that, to me, is a much bigger threat than the status quo. So any system that replaces the current one has to be more resistant to capture than the current one, in my mind. In time, I hope that systems such as DAOs will demonstrate themselves to be that. But in the meantime, it's also worth noting that there are a number of sort of knobs and controls that affect ENS in some way, and not all of them are as dangerous as others. So, and they all have different threat models. So what we are trying to do, and we're doing as a first step with this disablement of control over .eth, over ownership of the .eth name, is to identify all those different things, and perhaps the solutions aren't just hand all of these things over to a DAO. Perhaps the solutions are different for each. So in the case of ownership of .eth, we think we'll be comfortable with simply disabling that, because we're at a point where the registrar contract is stable. We're confident that it is free of significant bugs, and that any sort of change would necessitate a large migration anyway. So we can get much more security by simply locking that control out entirely than we ever would by handing it to a decentralized organization. At the other extreme of things is, for instance, the knob that controls, how much it costs to renew a name for a year. And although that's not risk-free, the damage somebody can do to the system by moving that up or down is much less than the damage they could do with control.
Far less catastrophic, yeah, and recoverable too, because you can
exactly
get back eventually. Yes.
Yep. So it may be that can be handed to a system or an organization that is less capture resistant than would be required for ultimate control of ENS itself. So we sort of want to approach decentralization in a sort of sensible and a piecemeal fashion.
Correct. Okay, Nick, it appears as though our Twitter live stream ended for some reason. I don't know why. So that ended, and I think we're still on YouTube, but I think we can be done.
Yep.
Okay, this is great. So thanks everybody for watching. If you're watching on YouTube or if you watch this later, and we may do this again in the future. So,
see you all.
See ya.
Bye.